You are my blood.
The crash of a shattered plate silenced the rustic diner, but it was the cruel laughter of the wealthy patrons that made Jin Ho-Joon stop dead in his tracks. Jin, a man who commanded the Korean underworld with a mere flick of his wrist, hadn't come to this rundown spot to play savior. He was there for a shadow meeting. But as he watched the young black waitress scrambling to pick up the broken porcelain in her crisp white uniform, her dignity under siege, a lethal annoyance flared within him. He stepped forward, the shadows clinging to his tailored black shirt, the sprawling lion tattoo on his neck visibly tensing. He was ready to reduce the aggressors to a violent memory. "Look at me," Jin commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that froze the room. The waitress flinched, her guarded posture trembling as she looked up. Jin stopped breathing. The violence instantly drained from his veins, replaced by a paralyzing, world-shattering shock. Beneath her smooth, deep brown skin and the neat braids pulled back behind her shoulders, a single tear tracked down her cheek. But it wasn't her vulnerability that broke the most dangerous man in the city. It was her eyes. Striking, bright, piercing blue. They were a perfect, impossible mirror of his own. Decades of ruthless, carefully constructed control cracked open in a single, breathless second. Jin leaned forward, his mouth falling open as a desperate, disbelieving whisper tore from his throat. "You are my blood." The diner smelled of old coffee and burnt toast. Yasmin wiped her forehead with a tired sigh. Her white shirt felt heavy after 8 hours of running plates. At the corner table, 3 wealthy men laughed loudly. They threw crumpled napkins at her feet. "Hey, waitress. Pick that up," one sneered. Yasmin kept her lips pressed tight. She needed this job to pay for her mother's medicine. She knelt down, her dark braids falling over her shoulders, and reached for the trash. The men laughed harder, calling her slow and useless. She swallowed her pride and stayed quiet. Just then, the bell above the door rang. Jin Ho-Joon stepped inside. He wore a crisp black shirt that swallowed the diner's light. His jaw was tight, and his dark hair was perfectly styled. The bold lion tattoo on his neck warned everyone to stay away. He was a feared Korean Mafia boss, here for a secret meeting. He hated messy, loud places. As he walked toward the back, he heard the cruel laughter of the men. He stopped. His cold eyes turned to the corner table, landing right on Yasmin on the dirty floor. Jin's patience vanished in a second. The sound of the men mocking the poor girl made his blood boil. He did not care about his secret meeting anymore. He walked slowly toward the table, his black boots thudding against the wooden floor. Every step held dark, dangerous power. The other customers noticed him and quickly stopped talking. The diner went dead silent. Only the 3 bullies kept laughing, totally unaware of the monster standing right behind them. Jin reached out and grabbed the loudest man by the back of his expensive collar. With one strong pull, Jin yanked him out of his chair and threw him against the wall. A plate shattered on the ground. The man gasped for air, his eyes wide with pure terror when he saw the lion tattoo on Jin's neck. "Pick up your own trash," Jin said. His voice was a low, scary rumble that echoed in the quiet room. The other 2 men froze like statues, shaking with fear. They knew exactly who he was. Jin looked down at the waitress. He expected her to run away in fear, but she stayed right there. Yasmin was still kneeling on the floor, holding a broken piece of a plate. She was trembling, not from fear of the rich men, but from the sudden, violent chaos. Slowly, she tilted her head up to look at the man who had just saved her. A single, shiny tear rolled down her deep brown cheek. Her lips were pressed together, showing her hurt and confusion. Jin stared back at her, ready to tell her to get up. But the words died in his throat. He completely froze. All the air left his lungs. As he looked at her face, he saw something impossible. Her eyes were a bright, striking blue. They were the exact same piercing blue eyes that stared back at him in the mirror every morning. The intense color was rare, unmissable, and undeniably his own. Decades of thick, invisible walls around his cold heart cracked open in a single moment. Jin leaned slightly forward, his tough face dropping into an expression of pure, breathless shock. The whole room watched as the scary Mafia boss dropped his defenses. He gasped loudly, his voice shaking. "You are my blood." The words hung in the quiet air like a heavy storm cloud. Yasmin stared at the strange, dangerous man in the black shirt. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. She did not know what he meant, but the raw emotion in his face terrified her. This man was a monster to everyone else, but he was looking at her as if she were a ghost. The intense connection in his bright blue eyes felt way too real.
Panic set in.
She dropped the broken pieces of the plate, the sharp sound snapping the silence. Yasmin quickly scrambled to her feet. Without saying a single word, she turned around and ran. She pushed past the swinging kitchen doors, tore off her black apron, and rushed out the back exit into the cold city alley. Inside the diner, Jin did not chase her. He could not move. The great Korean Mafia boss just stood there, completely frozen in place. His strong shoulders were slightly slumped, his authority totally forgotten. He kept staring at the empty space on the floor where she had just been, his mind spinning from the shocking truth. Jin stormed into his fancy headquarters an hour later. The shock was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning need for answers. His top men stood at attention, confused by his wild energy. "Find everything about the waitress at the diner," Jin barked. "I want to know her name, where she lives, and who her mother is. Bring it to me right now." For the next 3 hours, the entire criminal organization turned upside down. Hackers broke into city records. Spies asked questions in the streets. Nobody slept until Jin had a thick brown folder slammed onto his glass desk. He opened it with shaking hands. Her name was Yasmin Jonah. As he flipped the page, a picture of her mother stared back at him. It was a woman he had loved 20 years ago when he was just a poor street kid. He had left her to build his empire, never knowing she was carrying his child. Jin quickly ordered a secret DNA test, using the blood on the broken plate she had touched. By dawn, the results glowed on his computer screen. It was a perfect match. She was truly his daughter. The morning sun barely reached the narrow streets of Yasmin's poor neighborhood. She looked out her small, cracked window and froze. 5 shiny black cars blocked the entire road. Men in dark suits stepped out, standing like silent guards around her building. The neighbors peeked through their curtains, whispering in fear. Mothers pulled their children inside, locking their doors. Everyone knew these men meant serious danger. Yasmin's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed her coat, her hands shaking. Why was this scary man from the diner here? She marched downstairs, throwing open the front door of her building. Jin Ho-Joon stood in the center of the street, looking completely out of place in the dirty alley. His dark, sharp clothes screamed money and power. He took off his sunglasses as she stepped outside. His bright blue eyes locked onto hers again. "Yasmin." His deep voice echoed in the quiet street. He said her name like it was the most important word in the world. She stood her ground, crossing her arms to hide her fear. She was not going to let this monster scare her in her own home. Jin stepped closer to the rough concrete steps. He held out a thick brown envelope. "This is for you," he said softly. "It will pay for your mother's medicine, a new house, and anything else you ever need. You do not have to work at that diner anymore." Yasmin stared at the heavy package. She knew it held more money than she could ever make in a lifetime. For a second, she thought about her mother's medical bills and the cold nights without heat. But then she looked at the cold, proud face of the Mafia boss. He thought he could just buy her away like an object. Anger boiled up inside her chest. She snatched the envelope from his hand and ripped it open. Shiny stacks of $100 bills fell out. Without thinking, Yasmin threw the money right back at his chest. The green bills scattered onto the dirty street like useless leaves. "I do not want your dirty money," she yelled. "We survived 20 years without a dime from you. You cannot just show up and buy your way into my life." Jin stood perfectly still, shocked by her fiery rejection. Yasmin slammed her apartment door shut and leaned against it, breathing hard. The heavy sound of her boots woke her mother. The frail woman coughed, sitting up on the worn sofa. "Yasmin? What is going on outside?" she asked, her voice weak. Yasmin marched over and sat beside her. "A man is out there. A Korean man with bright blue eyes and a lion tattoo on his neck. He tried to give me money." Her mother's tired face suddenly went totally pale. Her shaking hands covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. "Jin," she whispered. Yasmin felt a cold chill run down her spine. "You know him, Mom?" He said, "I am his blood." Her mother let out a heartbreaking sob. She slowly told the story of a sweet, poor street boy she loved 20 years ago. She explained how Jin had left to build a better life, never knowing she was pregnant. He left behind a note and a little cash, breaking her heart forever. Yasmin listened in shock as the scary Mafia boss turned into the ghost that haunted her mother's life. Her anger toward him only grew stronger. Jin could not sleep. Yasmin's fierce rejection burned in his mind. He knew he could not force her to take his money, but he had to protect her anyway. The next morning, his black car pulled up behind the diner. He did not go inside to scare her. Instead, he made a quick phone call. Within 10 minutes, Jin bought the entire building in secret. He was now the owner. His first order of business was to call the cruel restaurant manager. The manager was a mean man who always made Yasmin work double shifts for very low pay. Jin's voice was as cold as ice over the phone. "Pack your things and leave immediately." "You are fired," he commanded. He hired a new, kind manager who was secretly one of his own loyal guards. He ordered the new boss to give Yasmin a raise, better hours, and absolute respect. Nobody was allowed to bully her ever again. Jin sat in his dark car, watching from a distance as Yasmin arrived for her shift. He felt a small wave of pride. He was finally acting like a father, silently shielding his daughter. For 2 weeks, things at the diner were suspiciously perfect. Yasmin got a huge raise and easy shifts. The new manager treated her like royalty. She thought it was just good luck until she went to the back office for extra napkins. She saw a shiny black folder on the manager's desk. The logo on the front was a roaring lion. It was the exact same mark as Jin's neck tattoo. Yasmin opened the folder and gasped. It was a property deed with Jin Ho-Joon's bold signature at the bottom. He owned the diner. Her blood boiled with pure rage. He was still trying to control her life from the shadows like she was a puppet. She grabbed her black apron and stormed out to the main floor. The busy lunch crowd watched in shock as she threw the apron on the floor. "Tell the boss I quit," she yelled at the manager. "Tell him he cannot buy my pride." She pushed through the glass doors and marched down the street, feeling totally betrayed. She refused to be a shiny new toy for a dangerous mobster who had abandoned her family. Jin's second-in-command, a sharp and cruel man named Tae, stood by the tall glass window of their dark office. He frowned as he checked the shipping logs. For the 3rd time this week, a huge shipment of illegal goods had been delayed.
Why?
Because the boss was missing. Tae walked over to the security monitors and zoomed in on a street camera. There was Jin, sitting in his expensive black car across from a cheap, run-down apartment building. He was watching a simple waitress walk home. Tae's eyes narrowed into angry slits. Jin was the most feared Korean mafia boss in the city. He was supposed to be a cold, heartless lion. But now, he was acting like a soft, foolish puppy over a girl with dark braids. Tae clenched his fists, his mind racing with dangerous thoughts. In their violent world, showing any weakness was a quick way to get killed. If the great Jin Ho-Joon was losing his edge over a poor waitress, someone else needed to take the throne. Tae smiled a cold, evil smile. He decided it was time to watch this little waitress very closely. The underground syndicate council room was cold and smelled of expensive cigar smoke. 5 older bosses sat around a heavy wooden table. Jin sat at the head, his face completely blank. The men did not look happy. One of the oldest bosses leaned forward, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "Jin, my friend, we hear you have a new hobby," the old man said slowly. "A little distraction in the poor part of town." Jin's blue eyes turned as hard as ice. His lion tattoo seemed to stretch as his jaw tightened. "My personal business is my own," Jin replied, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The old man smiled thinly. "Of course. But in our family, a distraction can be bad for business. If a toy is taking up too much of your time, we might have to break it." The threat hung heavily in the dark room. Jin slammed his fists on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He stared down the old men with pure, deadly rage. If anyone dared to touch Yasmin, he would burn their entire empire to the ground without a second thought. Dark, heavy clouds rolled over the city, unleashing a terrible rainstorm. Yasmin pedaled her rusty bicycle as fast as she could, her clothes soaking wet. When she finally burst through her apartment door, her heart dropped. Her mother lay on the floor, barely breathing. Her face was as pale as a ghost, and her hands were freezing cold. "Mom," Yasmin screamed, dropping to her knees. She grabbed her phone to call an ambulance, but she froze. She had exactly $12 in her bank account. The hospital would not treat her mother without money or good insurance. The rain pounded violently against the thin glass window, sounding like a ticking clock. Her mother let out a weak, painful gasp. Yasmin felt totally helpless and scared. She held her mother's thin hands, tears mixing with the cold rain on her face. The world was crashing down on her all at once. She needed a miracle. She needed a hero, even if that hero was a monster. With shaking fingers, she reached into her wet pocket and pulled out a small, fancy black card with a roaring lion printed on it. Yasmin stared at the black card in her trembling hand. It had only one phone number printed in shiny silver ink. She had sworn to herself she would never ask Jin Ho-Joon for anything. He was a dangerous criminal who had ruined her mother's life. But as her mother let out another weak moan on the cold floor, Yasmin's pride vanished completely. Survival was more important than anger. Her fingers slipped on her wet phone screen as she dialed the number. It rang only once before a deep, familiar voice answered the call. "Yasmin," Jin said, sounding breathless and shocked. A heavy sob escaped Yasmin's throat. "Please," she cried, her voice breaking in the dark, cold room. "It is my mom. She is dying. I have no money for the hospital. I do not know what to do. Please help us." "Stay right there," Jin commanded fiercely. His voice held no hesitation, only fierce, absolute protection. "I am coming." The phone clicked dead. Yasmin dropped the phone and held her mother tight. For the first time ever, she was depending on the father she never wanted. Less than 5 minutes later, Yasmin heard the screeching tires of heavy black cars outside. Heavy boots pounded up the stairs, and Jin burst through the door with 4 huge guards. Without a word, Jin scooped Yasmin's frail mother into his strong arms and carried her to his warm SUV. Yasmin climbed in, shivering from the cold rain and pure terror. The cars sped through the wet city streets, ignoring red lights. They arrived at the biggest private hospital in the city. Doctors and nurses were already waiting outside with a stretcher. Jin yelled orders in a loud, scary voice, and the medical staff moved like lightning. As they rushed her mother to the VIP wing, Yasmin watched in awe. Jin did not just pay the bill. He took over the entire hospital floor. Huge men in suits stood guard at every door. Doctors bowed to him nervously. Yasmin suddenly realized just how much power this man held. He was a king in this dark city, and he was using his terrifying strength to save the woman he had left behind. She finally saw the true Mafia boss. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Yasmin walked softly down the long, bright hallway, holding a cup of warm tea. As she reached the open door of her mother's room, she stopped dead in her tracks. Jin Ho-Joon, the terrifying Mafia boss, was sitting on a small chair next to the bed. His broad shoulders were completely hunched over. He was holding her mother's pale hand, his head bowed low. Yasmin hid behind the doorframe, holding her breath. "I was a coward," Jin whispered, his deep voice cracking with deep sorrow. I thought running away to build an empire would keep you safe. I was so wrong. I left you with nothing but empty promises and cold cash. I never knew about our beautiful daughter." A single tear fell from the Mafia king's eye, landing on the crisp, white sheets. He looked like a broken boy, not a dangerous ruler. Yasmin leaned against the wall, her heart aching. For the first time, she saw his true pain. He was not just a cruel monster. He was a man who had made a terrible mistake. Later that evening, the hospital staff set up a small folding table in the corner of the private suite. Jin ordered food from the finest restaurant in the city. Plates of warm steak, roasted vegetables, and rich potatoes filled the small space. Yasmin sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The silence between them was thick and awkward. Jin cleared his throat, looking everywhere except at her face. He clumsily picked up his fork, dropping it onto his plate with a loud clatter. The great, powerful boss looked totally lost trying to eat a simple dinner with his child. Yasmin watched him struggle and let out a tiny, soft sigh. She picked up a warm roll and handed it to him across the table. "You look like you need this more than I do," she said quietly. Jin looked up, his bright blue eyes wide with surprise. A tiny, nervous smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he took the bread. They did not speak another word, but the heavy ice between them slowly began to melt under the warm glow of the hospital lights. The next afternoon, Jin stood by the large hospital window, watching the busy street below. Yasmin sat nearby, reading a book. "You need to walk with your head up," Jin suddenly said, turning to face her. "If you look down, people will always step on you. You must make them fear you before they can hurt you." He puffed out his chest, his lion tattoo looking fierce and bold. He wanted to give her the heavy armor he wore every single day. Yasmin slowly closed her book and shook her head. "Fear does not make you strong," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "My mother never scared anyone, but she worked 3 jobs with holes in her shoes to keep me fed." She smiled at the people who treated her poorly. "That takes real strength." Jin stared at her, completely stunned. His entire life was built on violence and terrifying threats. But looking at his brave, quiet daughter, he felt incredibly small. She did not need his dark armor. She already had a pure, unbreakable spirit that no amount of dirty money or mafia power could ever buy. Yasmin finally decided to go back to her small apartment to grab some clean clothes. Jin did not want her to leave, but she promised to be quick. She walked out the hospital doors and hailed a yellow taxi. As her cab pulled away from the curb, a dark, unmarked car slid smoothly out of an alley. It stayed 2 car lengths behind her, matching her speed perfectly. Back in the VIP hospital wing, Jin's phone buzzed loudly. His top security guard sent an urgent text message. "Boss, we have a problem. Someone is tailing the girl." Jin's blood ran completely cold. His heart slammed against his ribs like a wild drum. He dropped his coffee cup, letting it shatter on the shiny floor. His worst nightmare was coming true. His dangerous world was bleeding into her innocent life. He grabbed his black coat and charged down the hallway, screaming orders at his men. His bright blue eyes burned with terrifying, pure rage. If anyone dared to lay a single finger on his daughter, he would tear the whole city apart piece by bleeding piece to get her back safely. Before Jin could leave the building, 5 heavy black cars blocked the hospital exit. The old, scary men from the syndicate council stepped out, their faces hard and completely unforgiving. Tae, Jin's cruel second-in-command, stood right behind them with an evil smirk. Jin stopped walking, his hands balling into tight fists. "What is the meaning of this?" Jin growled, stepping in front of the hospital doors like a fierce guard dog. The oldest boss stepped forward, pointing a crooked finger at Jin's chest. "You have become weak, Jin. Your enemies smell your fear. This girl is destroying our business." The old man's voice was sharp and totally cold. "You must choose right now. Either you cut all ties with the Waitress and prove your loyalty to our family, or you will lose everything. The empire, your money, and your throne." Jin stood frozen under the dark sky. the heavy weight of his violent past pressed down on him. He looked back at the hospital, thinking of Yasmin's bright blue eyes. The choice was terrifying, but deep in his lonely heart, he already knew his final answer. Jin pushed past the old men of the council and stormed back into the hospital. His heart pounded wildly against his ribs. He burst into the quiet VIP room where Yasmin sat beside her sleeping mother. She looked up, her striking blue eyes wide with worry at his heavy breathing. Jin walked over and knelt right on the cold, hard floor beside her chair. He did not care that he was the most feared boss in the city. He took her small, trembling hands in his own. "I am done," he whispered, his voice shaking with raw emotion. "I built a dark empire of fear and blood, but none of it matters. The cars, the money, the power, it is all completely useless if I cannot keep you safe." Yasmin stared at him, tears welling up in her eyes as the tough Mafia boss laid down his crown. "I promise you, Yasmin, I am walking away from that life forever. I just want to be your father." For the very first time, she squeezed his hands back. A tiny spark of hope finally lit up the dark shadows between them. Yasmin walked out of the hospital to catch some fresh air. Suddenly, two men in black masks stepped out from the shadows of an alley. They grabbed her arms tightly and shoved her against the cold brick wall. She tried to scream, but a heavy hand covered her mouth. "Do not move," a cruel voice hissed. The taller man pulled off his mask.
Yasmin gasped in pure horror.
It was one of the wealthy bullies from the diner on that very first day. He smiled a wicked, evil smile. "You thought that was just bad luck at the restaurant? You thought we just hated your service?" He laughed coldly. "Tae, your father's second-in-command, paid us to push you that day. Tae knew about you for months. He set up the whole fight, so the great Jin Ho-Joon would finally see your bright blue eyes in public. He wanted the whole syndicate to see their fearless lion turn soft over a hidden daughter." Yasmin's blood turned to pure ice. Her father did not find her by accident. The evil men in his gang had planned this trap all along to destroy him completely. Jin paced the hospital hallway like a trapped tiger. He pulled out his phone to order a private jet to fly Yasmin and her mother far away. He typed in his secret bank codes, but a bright red error message flashed on the screen. "Access denied." Jin froze. He tried his backup accounts, the hidden safes, and the offshore money.
Blocked.
Every single penny of his massive fortune was locked tight. His phone buzzed in his hand. It was a text message from Tae. "Enjoy your early retirement, old man. The throne is mine now." Jin's blood boiled with a blinding, terrifying rage. The poison had spread through his entire empire. His own men had betrayed him while he was sitting by a hospital bed. They had drained his money and stolen his power in a single night. He was no longer a king. He was just a poor, hunted man with a target on his back. Jin looked through the glass door at Yasmin. He had nothing left but his bare hands and his fierce love. He had to fight a war he never saw coming. Jin grabbed Yasmin's hand the moment she ran back inside, her face pale from the terrible attack. There was no time to explain. He sneaked her out through the hospital basement, leaving her mother safely hidden with loyal nurses. They stole a rusty old truck and drove deep into the dark, forgotten woods outside the city. They arrived at an old, hidden cabin that Jin had built years ago for absolute emergencies. Inside, it smelled like dust and old pine. Jin immediately took off his expensive black suit and threw it into the fireplace. He put on dark combat pants, heavy boots, and a tough tactical vest. He pulled hidden rifles and sharp knives from a secret floorboard. Yasmin watched in total silence as the gentle father from the hospital vanished completely. The soft, sad man was gone. The dangerous, deadly lion was waking up. He loaded a heavy gun with scary speed and precision. "Stay away from the windows," Jin commanded, his voice as hard as cold steel. He was preparing for a brutal war, ready to defend his only child with his very last breath. The dark woods outside the cabin suddenly grew totally silent. Not even the crickets made a sound. Jin turned off all the lights, plunging the room into pure blackness. "They are here," he whispered, pushing Yasmin safely behind a thick brick chimney. A second later, the front door exploded inward with a deafening crash. Heavy gunfire shattered the wooden walls, sending sharp splinters flying everywhere. Yasmin covered her ears and screamed. But Jin did not hide. He moved through the dark cabin like a terrifying, deadly shadow. He fired his weapon with perfect, ruthless accuracy. Every shot hit its mark. When 3 assassins rushed through the broken door, Jin dropped his empty gun and pulled out his hunting knife. He fought with the fierce, wild speed of a cornered beast. Yasmin peeked around the brick wall, her eyes wide with absolute horror and awe. She finally saw why the entire city feared the name Jin Ho-Joon. He was a perfect machine of violence. He took down 5 heavily armed men in less than a minute, standing tall in the moonlight like a true, terrifying lion defending his cub. The morning sun broke through the trees, but Jin felt only cold, heavy dread. He left Yasmin sleeping safely in the hidden cabin. He washed the blood from his hands and put on his last clean black shirt. He drove straight into the heart of the city, stopping right in front of the massive syndicate tower. The guards at the front doors aimed their heavy guns at his chest, but he did not blink. He slowly raised his empty hands, showing he brought no weapons to the fight. Jin Ho-Joon, the proud and terrifying Mafia king, was surrendering. He walked into the grand glass lobby, his boots echoing loudly on the marble floor. Tae sat comfortably in Jin's huge leather chair, smiling a cruel, greedy smile. "You look tired, old man," Tae laughed softly, twirling a silver knife. Jin stared at the traitor with calm, icy blue eyes. He did not care about the disrespect. He had only one goal in his mind. "I will give you everything," Jin said, his voice flat and perfectly steady. "The throne, the money, and the city. Just let my daughter and her mother live in peace." Tae smiled wider, his greedy eyes shining with evil delight. He clapped his hands, and a nervous lawyer hurried into the dark office. The lawyer carried a thick stack of official papers. They were the keys to Jin's entire life. Every secret shipping route, every hidden bank account, and every single piece of property he owned. Tae pushed a shiny gold pen across the glass desk. "Sign them all, boss. Show me how much you really love your little waitress," Tae sneered. Jin did not hesitate for a single second. He picked up the pen and began to write his bold, famous signature on the dotted lines. With every stroke of the pen, his massive, terrifying empire slowly vanished. The power he had built with his bare hands over 20 years disappeared into nothing. He was trading his heavy crown for his daughter's life. When the final paper was signed, Jin pushed the stack back across the desk. He stood up tall, feeling strangely light and totally free. He was no longer the dangerous lion of the city. "It is done," Jin stated firmly. "Do not ever come near my family again." Jin turned around to walk out of the quiet room, but the heavy doors suddenly locked shut. Tae laughed a cold, wicked laugh. "You are so foolish, Jin. Did you really think I would let you walk away alive?" Tae snapped his fingers, and 5 armed guards stepped out from the dark shadows. They aimed their weapons right at Jin's chest. But Jin did not look scared at all. He slowly pulled a small, black remote from his pocket and smiled. It was a calm, chilling smile. "I built this empire, Tae. I know all its weak spots," Jin said softly. He pressed the single red button on the remote. Instantly, alarms blared loudly throughout the entire building. Jin had secretly linked all the signed documents to a hidden computer virus. In seconds, every dollar Tae just stole was donated to random city charities. The secret shipping routes were sent directly to the police. Tae screamed in pure panic as his new throne crumbled to dust before he even sat on it. In the wild confusion, Jin smashed the glass window and smoothly escaped into the loud, busy streets, leaving the traitor with nothing. The dark city skyline slowly faded away in the rearview mirror. Jin gripped the steering wheel of a beaten-up, rusty green sedan. It rattled over every bump in the road, a huge change from his smooth, expensive black cars. Beside him, Yasmin sat quietly, watching the sunrise paint the sky in bright, hopeful colors. Her mother was sleeping peacefully in the back seat, finally safe from the dangerous shadows of the syndicate. They had no millions in the bank anymore. They had no grand mansions or powerful guards to protect them. Jin wore a simple, cheap cotton shirt instead of a tailored suit. His bold lion tattoo was covered up by the collar. He glanced over at Yasmin, his bright blue eyes soft and full of genuine warmth. She looked back at him and smiled a real, beautiful smile. The heavy anger that used to sit between them was completely gone. They had survived the terrifying fire together. As they drove down the long highway toward a quiet, unknown future, Jin finally understood the truth. He was the poorest he had ever been, but he felt like the richest man in the world. 3 bright, peaceful years passed like a sweet dream. The warm sun shone down on a green university field. Hundreds of cheering families gathered to celebrate the big day. Jin sat in the middle row, wearing a simple, clean white shirt and a pair of reading glasses. The scary Mafia boss was completely dead and gone. In his place sat a proud, ordinary father with a gentle smile. He clapped his hands loudly as the school principal called out the next name. Yasmin stepped onto the large wooden stage. She wore a long black graduation gown, her neat braids shining in the sunlight. She held her head up high with beautiful, quiet dignity. When the principal handed her the diploma, she turned and looked right into the crowd. Her striking blue eyes easily found Jin's matching blue eyes. She mouthed the words, "Thank you, Dad." Jin's heart swelled with pure, overwhelming joy. A single, happy tear rolled down his cheek. He had traded his entire dark empire for this exact moment. He finally realized that protecting her bright future was the greatest, most powerful thing he would ever do in his life. A true king does not measure his wealth by the money he holds, but by the family he protects. Sometimes, the greatest power you can ever have is the courage to walk away from the darkness for the ones you love. Did Jin make the right choice trading his empire for his daughter? Let us know what you would do in the comments below. If Jin and Yasmin's story touched your heart, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to Afro K Mafia Diary so you never miss another thrilling chapter. Thanks for watching.